Allow me to share with the men one of the most convicting metaphors in all of the Bible, plausibly even the most convicting metaphor in all of the Bible. In Ephesians chapter 5, Paul makes the turn to where he will speak to the husband and the wife. And when speaking to the husband, he says those famous words in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 25. He says, I want you to love your wife just as Christ loved the church, and he gave himself up for her. Now understand the context into which Paul says that. Under Patrio Potestas, you had these Greco-Roman guys who were walking around, and some of them were allowed to do anything that they wanted. They could hit their wife, they could beat their wife, they could kick their wife out, they could divorce their wife, sometimes even kill their wife. In the end, they could shove their wife into a corner while they went down to the local bathhouse and hung with their friends and even a prostitute. The reality was things were not loving in the home. And into the din of that is when the Apostle Paul says, I want you to love your wife the way that Christ loved the church. Now, that's a powerful metaphor. And in that metaphor, we begin to see unfurled in Ephesians chapter 5 the features, the marks of true love that a husband can showcase to his wife the way that Jesus loved his church. And so I'd like to share a few of those with you. Let me give you 4 features of a husband's true love. Number 1, it'll be a selfless or sacrificial love. Number 2, it'll be a sanctifying love. Number 3, it'll be a supplying love. And number 4, it'll be a securing love. Paul says in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 25, he says first that Jesus gave himself up for her, meaning the church. Jesus chose to be ridiculed. Jesus chose to be mocked. He chose to come, and even yet while we were yet sinners, he died for us. That was a choice. So as a husband, one of the greatest things that I need to remember, and you need to remember as well, is that when we love our wife, we do so in a sacrificial way. We love simply because we love. A lot of times the world says you love because of what they give back to you, right? The world says I have an object-based love, but not biblical love. No, not Christ's love. Christ's love is when I, as a husband, am going to love my wife by volition, by will, simply because it's the right thing to do. So do you love your wife that way? Does she know that no matter what she does, she's going to be cared for, loved, cherished, protected, exalted, simply because you love her? I had a couple come into my office, and the guy was sat there, and he actually was saying, you got to fix my wife, you got to fix my wife, you got to fix my wife. It's kind of the Neanderthal. I can't do it. Can you help me? And I had to look him in the eye and tell him, listen, buddy, it's real simple. Your job isn't to fix your wife. Your job is to love your wife. The Lord will fix your wife. You love her. The Lord will grow her. Do you love your wife? But then Paul goes on, number 2, look at this, and he says, not only do you have a selfless love for your wife, number 2, gentlemen, he says, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her, he moves on to a sanctifying love. We all know Jesus did that for the church. He justifies and then he sanctifies. He saves us for heaven, then saves us for holiness. But here Paul says, in the same way, I want you to beautify your wife, spiritually speaking. So often in the world, men will introduce horrific things into their marriage. Alcohol, and wine, and drug use, and pornography, anything to try to spice up the marriage. But Paul says, instead of introducing those things, I want you to introduce righteousness. I want you to guide her and lead her in the Word. I want you to make sure that actually she's more pure after she's married to you than she ever was before she married you. Not only is love sacrificial, love, he says, is to be sanctifying. Interesting, in verse 27, he actually goes on and he says, Christ is going to present her to himself one day, pure and spotless and white as snow. Now think about what that means. In a metaphor, it's a strong suggestion that one day Jesus will take the church and he will stand back before his Father and he will say, this is my beautiful bride. And yet Paul inserts that into a discussion between husband and wife as if to suggest that one day, maybe, gentlemen, you and I will stand before the Lord and he will call us into account before how we purified, spiritually speaking, our bride. I mean, think about that. You stand before the Lord ready to give your account for the deeds done in the body, both good and bad. And then he says, but son, weren't you married? You say, well, yes, sir. Yes, I was. And he says, well, where is she? And you turn around and say, well, she's over there in the bleachers waiting her turn to stand before you. He says, why don't you go ahead and get my princess and bring her over to me? And so you walk over, take her hand, and place her there before the Lord. He says, young buckaroo, stand over to the side. And then he grabs his princess and he begins to twirl her around, looking at her inside and out to see her beauty. And then he stands her to the side as he calls you back over and he says, now let's talk. Is my little girl more beautiful now than the day that she met you. It's a powerful picture to think about, taking our wife and presenting her before the Lord as one who's sanctified, one who's purified, one who's been cared for spiritually speaking. But he moves on not only from sacrificial love to a sanctifying love. He moves on there in verse 29 to a supplying love. You see it? He says, no one ever hated his own flesh, but instead he nourished that flesh and he cherished that flesh. You know, we all know Jesus did that for us. He cares for the needs of his people. Even the Lord's Prayer, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. We know that the Father cares for his children. And likewise, a husband will physically nourish his wife. He will protect her. He will provide for her. He will ensure, get this, that her body is more loved than even his own. You know, I had a friend who had a wife who was going through a tremendously horrific illness. And day after day, month after month, year after year, she just wasn't getting better. And get this, the doctors weren't doing anything about it. Maybe some of you have been in a situation like that. One day it clicked for my friend that he had to do something about it, because if that was happening to his body, he'd be fired up. And so he sat back at his computer and he typed this long email and he let them know they needed to make a change. This was malpractice. And he fired it off. Within hours, the doctors called and they began treating his wife. You know what my friend realized? He realized that I got to love my wife's body the same way that I would love mine. I got to protect my wife's life the way that I would protect mine, because that's what a man of God does. But not only is it a sacrificial love and a sanctifying love, and not only is it a supplying love, but he concludes and says it is a securing love. It is a love that will last. He says in verse 31, the two shall become one flesh. We know that's true with Christ. He gave us an unbreakable love. He's not leaving us. He's not going to forsake us. He's not going to walk away. And the world, the flesh, and the devil can do nothing to tear us apart. And he says, in the same way, gentlemen, you need to love your wife in a way that lets her know alimony's off the table, divorce is off the table, separation is off the table. There is nothing that will ever happen in which or to which or from which you will walk away. A lot of young theologians love the name B.B. Warfield, you know, the old Princeton warrior, holding his strong Calvinistic theology, a polemic against false doctrine. What they don't know about B.B. Warfield is that his wife Anne and he were on a honeymoon, and she was struck by lightning and immediately became an invalid. And yet for the next 30 years, Warfield never left her alone for more than 2 hours. Here's a man leading men at Princeton, and yet every 2 hours he would walk away from the classroom, go home to his wife, walk away from lunch, go home to his wife, take her arm and walk her in their front yard to ensure that she had a best friend. That's the picture of a man of God. Oh, he's tough in his doctrine, but he's tender with his wife. A sacrificial love, a sanctifying love, a supplying love, and beautifully, an enduring, securing love that lasts until the end.